All right, and now it is my pleasure to welcome our speaker tonight. It's going to be a treat. Come on up, Lisa from Newport Beach.
Thank you. I'm Lisa, and I'm an alcoholic. And I'm so happy to be here, and just such a great group. I love conventions, and I absolutely love Alcoholics Anonymous. And first, I just want to thank the committee, because I know so much goes on to putting on something like this, and all of the hard work that goes into it, and getting speakers and doing all of that. And so I really appreciate it, and I've had such a good time so far, and hearing Craig last night, and playing a little golf, and having a really good time. And I have a bunch of friends in this room, which feels so good, and people that I've known almost 40 years, and other people that I've connected with that are up here from where I live in Orange County, and it's just a treat. And I'm one of those people too that still, when I show up at a big meeting and there's like the cacophony of voices going on, I still want to turn around and leave the room, all these years later. And down where I live, there's a woman named Patty O, and one day I was going to a meeting at a place called the Canyon Club, and as I was walking up the road, and someone was driving her out, and Patty stuck her head out the window and said, go on in, your friends are in there. And there was something about that, it's that my friends are in the room of Alcoholics Anonymous, and whether you know it or not, welcome if you're new, and I hope you find the friends and the life and the sobriety and the love that I've found here, and people that know everything about me. And I always think of kind of the difference between my alcoholic friends and the normies, and years ago I had been speaking to my mother on the telephone, and just got really frustrated and hung up the phone with her, and I had boots on, and I donkey kicked the wall of my house, and my foot went right through the wall, like right through the plaster, and I was dating this normie guy at the time, and we were working together, and so I'd called to say, I'm going to be late, and he's like, well, what happened, and I said, I was talking to my mom on the phone, and kicked my foot through the wall, and he made such a big deal about it. He's like, what happened, and, are you okay? And it's like, yeah, and then I called one of my alcoholic friends who does plastering, and I said, can you come over here? I have this hole in the wall. And he's like, well, what happened? And I said, well, I'm talking to my mom on the phone, kicked my foot through the wall, and he didn't even miss a beat. He's like, I'll be right over, we'll just patch it up, and with alcoholics, it seems normal, yeah, kick your foot through the wall, let's just get you patched up and on your way, and that's why I love alcoholics, is that we can tell each other our secrets, we can share our lives with each other, and who knew. And I, like I said, I know people in this room here for almost 40 years, and I've grown up in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'm one of those people, when I first got here, I loved it. I loved AA. I loved the people. I loved everything about it. It was just the not drinking part that I wasn't fond of. I thought, if it wasn't for that, this would be great. Because I'm one of those alcoholics that likes to drink, and I tried everything to drink. I tried to, in relationships, out of relationships. At one point, I had some sobriety and drank because I thought maybe I was just young, or maybe long-term sobriety cured me of alcoholism, and I'll get into that. And lo and behold, that's not the case. And I love to, what we feel here and what we experience. And I love Carl Jung. I'm one of those people that I love the history of AA. I love the big book, and I read a lot, of Carl Jung, who I think, that conversation that he had with Roland that really set the direction of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's like those seconds and inches they talk around here, and Roland had been in psychotherapy with Carl Jung, and said, to Roland, alcoholics of your type, you're hopeless, and Roland said, isn't there any exception? And Dr. Jung said, well, on occasion, we see people have these profound spiritual experiences, and that really set the course. And later in his life, Carl Jung said, I think modern people don't know God because they don't look low enough. And what I got out of that was, sometimes we're looking just way out there, instead of what we experience here, the stories that we share with each other, the lives we share with each other. And I've certainly have felt something here in Alcoholics Anonymous that I was looking for my entire life. And kind of going back, I'm the youngest of four. I grew up in a place called the San Ynez Valley. It's up near Santa Barbara in California, and it's ranch land. There's just horses and vineyards, and people just drank there. It was just a hobby, and it's just what people did. And I was the youngest of four, and when I was born, I was like this little accident to my family. So when I was born, my oldest brother was almost 22, and my sister was 15, and my other brother was 14. And to tell you a little bit about my family, what it was like, my siblings and I had very different experiences growing up, but my oldest brother, for instance, he went to Vietnam, and he was in Vietnam when I was born, actually, and we had a conversation, and he had volunteered. He wasn't drafted. He had volunteered to go to Vietnam, and he was shot, came back, and he went back again. And so I talked to him, and I said, I can almost understand why you went the first time, but why'd you go back? And he said, well, look, sis, I had a choice between Vietnam and mom and dad, and I chose Vietnam. And that was my household, and he meant it. And so with them, there was yelling and fighting, and it was just chaotic. And they would come home, and everybody had these big personalities, and I just remember it being just very loud and chaotic. And I was just this little kid, and I was a seeker, I remember being like 4 or 5 years old and looking in the mirror. I was in my bathroom looking in my mirror, and my mom came in and said, what are you doing? And I'm like, where was I before I got here? And I would consciously remember thinking at that age, like, where was I? And where am I going after this? And my mom didn't know how to, answer those questions. She started to talk to me about how babies are born or something, and then I said, that's not it. That's not it. And so I always had this thing of, what's the purpose? What is this all about? And I, being, the having older brothers and we didn't have a lot of alcohol in our house. I ultimately found out later, like my mom and dad didn't really drink too much, but, we always had sangria in the fridge. And in fact, I was like 15 before I'd learned like sangria wasn't juice. I just thought it was juice. And so we always had the sangria around, and there was just like a lot of drinking in our community. And, but it was my brother. So I remember I was like 11 years old, and my brothers got me stoned for the first time, and I smoked, and I don't even know if I was high or what it was, but we lived out in the country, and they said they wanted candy or something, and they're like, well, take the car to town. So I was like 11, I'm driving the car, going to town, and then shortly after that, I started drinking, and I'm one of those people, I just crossed that line at the very, very, very beginning. I went from like 0 to 60. It was like I was a kid, and then I was an alcoholic. And ultimately, I learned about that. I learned that there was a lot of alcoholism in my family, especially on my dad's side. And it was one of the reasons my dad didn't drink. He didn't drink that often, because my mom didn't want him to drink. And But I crossed that line at the beginning, and I loved it. You know, it was really that thing that, you know, Clancy always talked about. You know, it's this, we drink and it hits our system, and it's that kaboom. And that's what I felt. And it was the missing piece of me. And I would, you know, stash bottles of alcohol, driving down to get on, you know, walking down to get onto the bus to go to school. And at school, you know, I never felt a part of, and always felt different. And certainly I felt different because no one drank the way that I did, you know, no one did. And so I really hid that for a very, very long time. And when I was about 15, my mom and I got in a really serious car accident, and she almost died in that accident. And my dad had worked for an aerospace company, so he was either in LA or Seattle, and we were in the San Ynez Valley. And after that accident, my mom wanted to spend more time with my dad because my siblings were out of the house, and my dad would come home on the weekends. She wanted to be with him. So my mom sat me down and said, okay, you have some options, and I could either move to LA, or I could move up to Seattle, or I could stay at our home in San Ynez at 15, and no one else would be there, and they'd come home whenever. And I will say, you know, it was the 80s, so it was a different time, you know. It's like we really were kind of raised feral, you know, we really were just kind of left to ourselves to raise ourselves, and you know, I certainly was. And so I said, I'll stay here. So at 15, they left me the car. I didn't have my driver's license yet, and I was only supposed to drive to school and back, and so instead I was in LA. I was everywhere except school, and I acted like I was 25 years old. You know, I'd drink wine and do my homework, and it was so bizarre. And then the whole family would come home. I actually have a huge family, so I was utterly alone, and then this whole family would come home. And at one point I had been like really, really drunk and sick. My dad had been home actually, and he knew I was drunk. And the next day I was supposed to go to this concert down in Santa Barbara, and my dad said, you know, well, I don't think you should go because you've been drinking. And you know, and I looked at him, I go, you don't even live here. You know, and I mean, this man like kind of helped to run an aerospace company, and he used to say, like, I can run this company and I can't control this 15-year-old kid, you know, 15, 16-year-old kid, but that's the way it was. And in my family, you know, you're supposed to go to college and do all these things, and I had reached all the number of absences that I could have, and I was told if you miss any more, you know, you're not going to graduate. And I remember, you know, it was 3 weeks before my high school graduation, and like they say, we're really good starters and we're really poor finishers, and I was right there, and I wanted to go to a party. I hadn't had a drink that day, and I wanted to have a drink, and I left, and so I ended up not graduating from high school, and I watched my high school graduation. I sat up on the hill and drank vodka, and it was all very dramatic, and watched them, and I just thought, you know, whatever, you know, kind of losers that they did all that. And so I was out of control, and it was shortly after that time I ended up moving down to Santa Barbara, and my parents thought I was going to college. I was supposed to be going to college in Santa Barbara, but I wasn't. So they would send me these checks, and I would cash the checks, and then just drink and do other things too, you know. And during that time, I used to make up pain. So I would say, and back in the 80s, they would, if you had pain, they'd give you like morphine or, you know, all kinds of stuff. And so I'd make up pain, and usually it worked. I'd go to the doctor and get pain medication and drink, you know, vodka was always my thing. I'd take that pain medication. But this one time I had pain, I went to the doctor, and he did all these tests, and he said, you have acute appendicitis. We need to take your appendix out, like right now. And I knew for sure there was nothing wrong with me. I had just been, you know, up and drinking, and I knew there was nothing wrong. And I sat there thinking, I could tell this man there's nothing wrong, or I can go have surgery. And it's one of those, you know, easy decisions we make. I'm like, let's go have surgery, because it was like I knew in a period of hours I was going to be out, you know, and I was looking forward to that, and I was. And so by the time I got sober the first time, I had my appendix out. I had a number of procedures, like medical procedures and all kinds of stuff. And so luckily, you know, when I got sober, that I didn't have a kidney removed or something, because I would have done whatever I could. And I kind of tried to get sober. I had met this woman, and she was sober in AA, and I had gone into like this rehab place. They brought us to an AA meeting, and I just thought, this place is great. Maybe I'll give this a try. But I didn't take it seriously. I thought I was young, and at the time, I was very goth, and so I'd always dress in black. So I was dressed in black, and I'd wear like white lip liner and eyeliner, and wouldn't smile, and was just very, very dark, and I liked that, and there was this Depeche Mode song, and it was my favorite, and it was, that I think that God has a sick sense of humor, and when I die, I think I'll find him laughing, and I would like listen to this music, and it's very dark, and so there was always these other sides to me too, because also I was someone, I would do cocaine and read the Bible, it was like, I loved like the spiritual aspects of life, but then I was an alcoholic, and so in the midst of all of that, I started to go to therapy with a man, and who was a medical doctor, but he did therapy, and so I started in therapy with him, and at first I was going like once a week, and then he said, I think you need to start coming here twice a week, and so I did, and he said, maybe 3 times a week, so I started going 3 times a week, and during one of our sessions, I said to him, I think I like older men, and so he looked at me, and he just said, well, I'm an older man. And prior to that time, he used to talk to me about getting sober, but then it was, now I would also say when I first got here, I thought I had never prostituted myself, or, but I remember looking at this man who was not that attractive at all, and I just looked at him and I thought, he had a prescription pad, and he said I could have a horse. So I could have a horse in Montecito, and he had a prescription pad, and he said I could drink, and so we started this thing, and on occasion I would like overdose, and then he'd discharge me from the hospital, and so it was chaotic. One night we were having dinner, and he was crying. He wanted to get married, and he was crying, and I said to him, and I was young, I was like, at this time, like 20 years old, and I said, you're my therapist, like I'm supposed to cry about something, not you, and so it was just bizarre, and during that time, I had 2 cardiac arrests, my first cardiac arrest, I was 18 years old, and my heart just stopped. One day, I just had too much alcohol, and my heart stopped, and I woke up, and in those days, they used to pound on your chest, and I woke up, and I was just hurting, and so needless to say, I wasn't functioning in society very well, and I remember I called this woman Jan, and now prior to that time, I didn't know if I was an alcoholic. I didn't know what was wrong with me, but I did know when I started drinking, I couldn't stop, and I also knew that I wanted to stop, and I couldn't, and so I called her, and I started to go to AA meetings, and that was the first time, and she was amazed. She was the first person, in fact, she said to me, you can't have a relationship with this doctor, like it's wrong, and she worked at the hospital where he had privileges, and she said, it's really wrong, this isn't right, and which was kind of good for me to hear that, because I had a mother, she's passed away now, but I adored her, but she was a hopeless romantic, and because I remember talking to her about the guy, and she goes, oh, well, he's a doctor, honey, like not thinking there was anything wrong. And so I met my sponsor, and I got sober, and my life really, really turned around. I got sober up in Santa Barbara, California, and it was amazing AA. And I remember the first time I heard a man named Johnny Harris speak, and this man couldn't have been any more different than me. He had been, in gangs in the 40s and 50s, and he had been in prison, and here I was, this girl from, Santa Barbara County, and I was young, but he talked about what makes the big hurt go away. And he talked about alcoholism in a way that I got it. I thought, if that's alcoholism, I have that. And I've never related to anybody more than that story. And years ago, I read this thing that, on occasion in our lives, something happens, and our lives are split in two, to the time before that event and the time after that event. And I would say that time being in that meeting and acknowledging I'm an alcoholic, it would never be the same. And it would never be the same in all of the best ways. And back then too, I love the fact where I got sober, because sometimes now in the meetings I go to, there's a lot of talk, we're broken, we're damaged, we're the broken toys, all this kind of stuff. I didn't get sober like that. I got sober with people showing me the big book, and that our program of Alcoholics Anonymous, it's transformative. We change. We, for some of us, we're restored to sanity. Some of us are returned to normal living. Now, I never had normal living before, so there was no returning to that. But, just that we actually do what's in that book, and all of those things, and it absolutely changed my life. And during that time, and I also had a sponsor that was, what are you going to do now? And I learned AA etiquette here, how to sit, thank the speaker, be quiet, all of those things, and which really taught me these skill sets when I went out into the world. My sponsor said, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I need to go back. I want to go back to school. I should go back to school. And so, and I had always, prior to that, I'd gotten my GED, so I had the high school thing, and I said, I want to be a lawyer. I want to go to law school. And she said, then let's do that. Let's start going to school, And so I started going to school, and met this man, and had a great relationship, and a great life, and a great life of sobriety, and it was really the people in Alcoholics Anonymous that helped me with all that, and really got me to even be able to have that position. And at one point, years later, when I had graduated from law school, and when you graduate, you have to they have to do an investigation of you, do this ethics exam thing, and so I'd already passed the bar, and so I was ready to start practicing law. And I get this letter from the California Bar of Examiners that said, we cannot account for your whereabouts from 1986 to 1988. And I was in a panic. I was like, oh my God, I knew it. I knew my past was going to catch up with me. And I called my sponsor, and I was just in a panic, and she said, you know what? And I was on my way to a meeting. She said, go to your meeting. She goes, I know somebody, I'm going to call him. And just go to your meeting, don't worry about it. And so later that night, she called me, and she said, tomorrow, a man's going to call you, and I want you to answer your phone, and I want you to tell him everything, be honest with him. And so the next day, this man called, and he had this booming voice, and he's like, honey, I hear you got yourself into some trouble. And he's like, tell me about it. And I said, well, during these years, I'm drinking, and all this stuff. And so I told him everything, and he was laughing. He had this big booming voice, and he's laughing, and he said, okay, and he goes, I'm gonna make some phone calls, and I'm gonna give you a call back. I'll give you a call back. And he didn't say when, but the next day he called me, and he said, congratulations, honey, you've been admitted to practice law by the state of California. And I go, who are you? Because this whole time I have no idea who this man is. And I said, I just knew he knew my sponsor. And I said, are you a lawyer? And he goes, well, I used to be, but for the past 30 years, I've had a new gig. I sit on I'm a justice on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal. And that the man named Bill G., who had been sober for many years in Alcoholics Anonymous, and he just said, I'm proud of you, honey. I'm proud, and you're going to do great things in your life. And it's people like that have been in my life for many, many years. And I mentioned before that, my sobriety is also, my story is also one that at 16 years of sobriety, and some of it is kind of the predictable story, but at 16 years of sobriety, I had also had, there was a lot of success. I had moved from where I first got sober, and had met a man, and he drank fine wine, and I had and friends, and they were going to Napa, and they were going to France, and I had been active for many years, but for the last, probably turning 14, 15 years sober, I started to think that maybe I was just young. And maybe now it was going to be different, and maybe long-term sobriety had cured me of alcoholism. And so I talked to all my normie friends about it, whether I could drink again. And at this time, I'm managing partner of my law firm, and so my normie friends were like, I bet you could. And I said, I bet I could. And now I never spoke to any of the people sitting in this room, and I never spoke, so anyway, the day I drank, it wasn't planned. We had one of the attorneys in my law firm, we took him to the courthouse to get sworn in, and we were at a restaurant in Laguna Beach, and my office administrator had ordered a margarita, and part of the problem was I had also ordered a virgin margarita, so we call that kind of entertaining it, but certainly no intention to drink that day. And my office administrator said, man, my drink's strong. And I go, is it? And she's like, yeah, it's really strong. And she goes, do you want to switch with me? And it was like some of the book. And I said, yeah, I do. And so I took that first sip, and, at first I was panicked. I thought, oh my gosh, and then that second hit, and I just thought, why the heck have I not been drinking for 16 years? It was like kaboom. It wasn't, I was young, it was a stage. And my law partner came over. He knew I was sober, and so he, said, do you know what that is? And I go, yeah, we drink in AA. And so for many years, he thought, in fact, years later, he came to AA, and he said, Lisa said I could drink here. I'm like, no, we don't drink here. Like, that's not what happens. But something really profound happened in that I also knew that the words that we hear, powerlessness, unmanageability, that was a real thing, and it was something that I absolutely could experience, and I knew it before I knew it, and that also the absolute daily reprieve that we get around here, and that and when I first got sober, I was young, so I thought laurels, we don't rest on our laurels. I thought that was our ass, and I didn't know our laurels are, our accolades, we can't stay sober on yesterday's sobriety, so thankfully, I got back here really quickly. I was only out for, about a month. I was trying to pull it off, and ended up in California, we have something called the Desert Roundup, and I thought I was going to be able to go out to that roundup and play golf with my friends that were sober, and Johnny Harris was one of them. We were playing golf, and he just knew. He knew, and he said to me, he took his shot in the fairway, and then he looked at me and he said, you know what, honey, I've loved you since you were 19 years old, and there's nothing you can't say to me that we can't find a solution to. And then he just walked up the fairway, and so it all came crumbling in, and so I got back here, and that was almost 17 years ago, and now in my sobriety, it's amazing too, is that I think before, and also being young, I love the stories, in fact, even back then, I love the story. There'd be a speaker up here, and they'd say, I was a Skid Row bum, and, now I'm president of IBM or whatever, and as a kid, you're like, man, that's awesome, and I'm like, I want that, and now it's every sober breath I take is an absolute miracle of God. And for any alcoholic to not take a drink is an absolute miracle. And so it also gave me a real sense of compassion, and a real sense of understanding of alcoholism, and certainly, deflating of arrogance. But there's this part too, spiritually, is that, and it was hard to come back, and I had this moment where I'd come back and I had about 30 days sober maybe, and I was that morning driving to my firm, driving to my office in Laguna. I saw this woman walking in Laguna on the street, and for some reason she caught my eye, and she was just she's dressed nice, but she just kind of caught my eye. I was just noticing her, and so she's kind of walking around, and so I didn't think anything about it, and I go up into my office for the day, and I had opened all the windows, and a bird flew into my office, and it was like up in the rafters flying around, and it was annoying me, and I couldn't get this bird out of my office, and I just thought, I'm just gonna get a cup of coffee. And I normally never would have done that. It was like 10 o'clock, I wouldn't have done that. And so I walked to get coffee, and I see this woman again. And for some reason, I just stopped. And I said, is there anything I can help you with? And she said, yeah, I'm looking for a place called the Canyon Club. Do you know it? And the Canyon Club is a place in Orange County that has AA meetings. And I said to her, yeah, no, I do know it, and I go, it's quite a ways from here though. So if you want to ride, I can take you there. And she goes, I'd love to. And so she said, I said I'm a friend of Bill's, blah blah blah. So I said, come up to my office, I'll get my keys. And there's this bird up in my office, and so we walk up there, and there's no bird in my office. Like it was, it was not there. And I said to her, I swear there was this bird. But this lady, we start talking, and as I'm driving her to the meeting, and I said, what are you doing here? And she said, I'm here from out of town with my husband, and he's in his business meetings, and she said, I have 16 years sober, and I'm walking back and forth trying to decide if I'm going to drink or not. And so I just told her, I said, I have 30 days sober, and I drank when I had 16 years, and I told her my story, and I said, don't do it. It's, and frothy emotional appeal never works, with us. But I just told her, I said, this happened to me. And so we talked for 3 hours. We just sat there and talked. And that was, almost 17 years ago. And she didn't drink. She never drank again. And every year she would send me a card of her sobriety. And I realized that, our stories in Alcoholics Anonymous they're also more than the number. It's, each of our stories has such an impact, and how hard it is to share our stories sometimes. And a lot of times sobriety can be messy and not perfect. But she, really taught me that, to be honest, to just show up, be honest, share my story, and share my life with alcoholism. And now, I go to a lot of meetings I sponsor, we go through the book, and I absolutely try to live what is in that book, what's so beautiful. And I thought when I first got here too, that this was just about not drinking, and it is. A lot of times when people say, that it's not, just not drinking. Certainly it's a lot more than that, but just the fact we don't drink is so amazing. But we also have, these principles in the book, these principles to live by. We always, in Orange County sometimes, when we do the readings, and people kind of chant, the principles before personalities, and so I always go over with my sponsees, well, what are those principles? There's all the principles and the steps, and the principles and the traditions, and it's these things. To me, a principle is something we absolutely live. If we're not living it, then it's just a concept, and a concept is just out here, but the principles are what we really, really live. And we have the principles of the steps of, willingness and surrender and love, but the principles of the traditions, at least in my mind, have really made me a better person. The principle of unity, the principle of equanimity, that we become so much more for the whole, And that really changed my life, and to live that and to know that, and I'd love to, one time I was at this meeting, and there was this just brand new guy, and everybody was talking about God and sharing these big lofty concepts about God, and this guy, and I'm pretty sure he was homeless, he was just kind of looking down, and he said, it seems to me that when God comes through, it's right at the buzzer and it's all net. And it just hit me like a ton of bricks, this higher power, this thing that, to me, brought me to Alcoholics Anonymous for the first time, and then also saved my life again, to be saved the first time and then the second time. And also at the end of his life, Carl Jung was asked, Dr. Jung, do you believe in God? And Carl Jung said, do I believe in God? No, I don't believe in God. I know God. And I've experienced that here, this knowing, this connection, this different, something higher. And a few years back, and I still practice law. I've practiced for a long time, and I still do. And but a few years ago, a while back, I went to seminary. I'd wanted to go to seminary, and like I said, I was always, one of those people. I wasn't scared of the God stuff when I got here. And in fact, in Santa Barbara, there were these monasteries really close. So there were also nuns and priests in the room and these spiritual people. And I liked that. It gave me a sense of comfort. And also this thing of, wow, these people have left church to come here. Like, what is happening here that they, need to be here? But I did that, and I still practice law, but those 3.5 years had been something I had always wanted to do. And I recently was talking to somebody, and they were talking about the fact that, and I get it, that we recover from alcoholism, and that we're recovered from this hopeless state of mind and body, and we are, we become recovered from that. But at the same time, because this person was also saying, and as a result of that they were no longer powerless. And so I get it, I get it as a concept of what they were saying, but inside I was thinking, I never want to get to the fact again to ever think that I'm not powerless over alcohol, despite being recovered from the hopeless mental state. And that in our book too, and this was the other thing I had, I knew, but to live it is something entirely different, is that, alcoholism is physical and mental. And so we quit drinking, and that's great, that takes away that phenomenon of craving, but then we're left with the mental aspect of that. And that's the part that has to be treated on a daily basis. That's why we keep coming to meetings. That's why people with time go to meetings. We never get away from this place. And if you're new, I hope you find somebody that, you can really open your life up to. I know that my sponsors, except for one, were always people I could absolutely trust. They always say we're as sick as our secrets, and I always say then all of us should be, secret keepers, to really make sure that we're people that, because a while ago I did have a sponsor where I shared one of my deepest secrets, and a week later her husband walked up to me and had said, what I had shared with her, and it was really devastating. And so besides that one, it's, we need to have people here that we can share our lives with, and share those secrets and do the steps, and that our lives transform, our lives change, we transform, and what I originally thought, just we're not drinking is something so much more than that. And I hope too that, a lot of times people with time come up, and I know before at 16 years when I drank, I really thought, I was thinking things and doing things that I thought I probably shouldn't, and I didn't want to tell anybody because I thought we're supposed to be perfect here, and not realizing it is Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, it's, you know, we're not perfect around here, but now, and even a lot of the people I sponsor have more time than me, you know, and people come to me and they say, yeah, I have a secret. You know, I have a secret I need to share, or, you know, I have 25 years sober and I feel like drinking. And I would talk to a guy a couple of months ago, and he had 20 years sober, and his sponsor had him call me because he wanted to drink. And he said, yeah, I just feel like drinking. I feel like I was young. And I said, it's so interesting. Like, the first thing alcoholics do when they, you know, say they're not alcoholic is drink. You know, it's like, I said to him, well, if you're not alcoholic, because his life was totally together, successful, married, kids, all of these things. And I said, so if you're not alcoholic, why do you want to drink? Why would you jeopardize that? Why don't you go to golf school? Or why don't you go do, you know, something else? And I said, do you think you'd lose your family if you drank? And he said, yeah, I'm pretty sure I would. And I said, you know, do you think that's a good thing for your kids? And he goes, no, I don't think it would be. And I said, then why drink? And if you're not alcoholic, why do it? You know, and you know, later he called and he's like, I don't think I'm going to drink. You know, I think I'm going to, you know, so, and he got back and he started going to 90 meetings in 90 days. And then I was happy that, you know, my experience could help with that in some way. And so again, you know, and I'll just kind of wrap up that, you know, if you're new, you know, I hope you find your picket fence. I know that in my life, you know, I have my picket fence, and to show up, you know, this man Clancy also used to say, you know, the role of a sponsor is to get you to take actions you don't believe in. You know, and we often don't believe, how can going to a meeting help? How can going to a convention help? You know, how can having a commitment? And because, you know, we have all these other problems that need to get fixed. And, but it's amazing how it works, and how we get better, and how our lives just get, you know, tremendously useful. And I'll just end by saying at the end of his life, Dr. Bob gave a very short talk at the first AA convention, and he died shortly after that. And it was very, very brief, and he just said, and I'll paraphrase, but, you know, at the end of the day, that this all comes down to love and service, and let's not muck it up with Freudian concepts, and let's not muck it up with smug complacency. And when I, you know, when I heard that, it was like, smug complacency. And, you know, and he said, you know, we all know what love is, and we all know what service is. And, you know, and today you know, I try to live that. And so thank you again. Thank you for having me be here. That's it.